listening to theoutdoorstation.co.uk.
Welcome back to the book club. I'm Andy Howell. The last time Chris Townsend joined us here on the Outdoor Station, we talked about his book Crossing Arizona, an account of a trek across that desert state. Chris told us he regards Crossing Arizona as his best book to date, but no sooner as this had been made available than a number of you contacted us to say great stuff and can we please hear Chris talking about his walk through the Yukon. So recently we tempted Chris back to talk about the book he considers to be his second best book. I started by getting my bearings right, checking with Chris that this was a walk through Canada and Alaska and over 1,000 miles in length.
Very roughly it was 1,000 miles. It's impossible to say how far because when I did it the maps were not very good and a lot of the route I was making up as I went along. So 1,000 miles is a nice round figure. It's probably give or take 200 at least in either direction. So it's more likely to be more than less. And just to clear up where it is, yeah, I mean the Yukon Territory is basically the northwest corner of Canada, abutting Alaska.
And this is very much kind of Klondike Gold Rusher area, isn't it? It's that kind of frontier land.
Oh, very much, yes. Yeah, I mean the Klondike is in the heart of the area, and I went through the Klondike on the walk, and also for much of the way, I followed the route that the Klondike would-be miners, given that most of them never actually did any mining at all, but would-be miners took to get there. So it was only really when I got north of the Klondike and towards and into the Arctic that I was away from, the gold mining side of things.
And so where on earth did this idea for this wilderness trek come from? I mean, these days you hear people a lot talking about Alaska and the Northwest, but this was in 1990, wasn't it? So you must have been an early pioneer of this trail. I wondered where you got the inspiration from for doing it.
Well, two years earlier, I'd walked the length of the Canadian Rockies, which was a first. And I was very impressed with the remoteness and wildness of the northern section, where I met hardly anybody at all. In fact, most of the people I met there were outfitters leading hunting parties in the autumn. But someone, I can't even remember who now, but someone was up there and said, well, if you like this, you ought to go to the Yukon. And at the end of that walk, I mean, the end of the Canadian Rockies, where they fade away at the Liard River, is just south of the boundary with the Yukon Territory. So I finished that walk sort of looking into the Yukon and thought, well, I'd like to come back and continue north. So that's what I did. And certainly in terms of long distance walking, I think it was a pioneering walk. As far as I know, nobody has even attempted to repeat it. So it's still the only, 17 years later, it's still the only one.
And there's a challenge to those of you out there with a sense of adventure. Now, you started at Skagway in Alaska, so presumably you were walking from north to south.
From south to north.
Oh, right, south to north. And it was 83 days of walking? Right. So, and how much of that, I mean, you're not near civilization much of that time, I guess.
Not much, no. I mean, the planning of the walk, I mean, as always, I had to plan it for where I could get supplies or how I could resupply. And that was much more difficult in the Yukon than any other walk I've done because there are so few towns. I mean, when I was there, the Yukon is 186,000 square miles. I don't know what the population is today. It's probably not much bigger. But when I was there, the population was just under 30,000 for the whole territory. And 20,000 of those lived in the capital city, Whitehorse. So as you can see, through the rest of the territory, there's not many people. Not much in the way of towns and villages. In the south, which is where most people live, I was able to resupply, at local stores and post offices every week to 10 days. but that was 3 or 4 times I did that. But then I managed to come to an arrangement with a commercial riverboat company that took people on tours up and down the Yukon River, that they would call in at this old camp beside the river, Fort Selkirk, and drop off a food parcel for me. That was great, because that meant I could spend 3 weeks between loads without having to carry 3 weeks' food, which would have been backbreaking. But as it was, I met them halfway through that period, so I only needed to carry 10 days at once.
But 10 days for food is an awful weight, isn't it? It's a lot of weight to carry for time.
It is, yes. I mean, given the lightweight revolution that we have going on at the moment, I was a bit surprised myself when I had a look at how much I carried. I mean, my basic pack weight for that trip was 40 pounds, and that was without the 9 pounds of camera gear.
Yeah, and that's about what in kilograms? I'm lost now with old money.
I have to. I mean, you can very roughly halve it for kilos. But so we're talking about, I was mostly carrying, 20 to 25 kilos.
Yeah, that's not bad, considering a kind of good average backpacking weight these days is probably, about 8 or 9?
Well, for lightweight, probably for most people, it's probably more like 12, I would think. But yeah, it's a lot less than that. But of course, you're allowing that this was going on a really remote wilderness walk that was going to finish well north of the Arctic Circle. So the equipment had to deal with that.
So take us through the elements of the walk. I mean, it was more populous at the beginning by the sound of it, but...
The beginning was the only place where I had a real trail, and it's the Chilkoot Trail, which runs from Skagway into Canada. And that's the route that the Klondike would-be miners took when they arrived. They arrived on the coast at Skagway, and then they had to carry enough supplies for a year over the pass before they were allowed into Canada. And the Canadians put the Mounties with a machine gun post on the border just to make sure. So you can imagine it took them a long time back in the 1890s to shift a year's worth of supplies across the pass. And this was done simply because the Canadian government was really worried that all these, as they basically were, naive would-be miners, were all going to die in the Yukon because they wouldn't have any food and they wouldn't have anywhere to live and so on. But this trail, which is now a proper trail, runs for about 30 miles into Canada. And that was the only time I was on a trail as such for the whole walk, and the only time I met other walkers. But once you get into Canada, into the Yukon proper, I then followed river valleys, a few relatively gentle mountain ranges, lots of forest walking north. I mean, the central part of the Yukon is, if you like, rolling hill country, masses of forests, deep river valleys. It's not alpine-style mountains. So you can walk almost anywhere if the terrain lets you. And the main obstacle to the terrain letting you is dense forest rather than anything else. But I made a way north, and this took me basically through Whitehorse, the capital city, and on to the Klondike area of the Yukon, and to Dawson City, which was, the chief town at the time of the Klondike mining. North of there, the terrain changes because you're getting towards the Arctic. It's more mountainous. I went through one of the most spectacular mountain ranges I've ever been through, the Tombstone Mountains, which are absolutely amazing granite peaks. And the trees start to dwindle away as you get across the Arctic Circle. You get much more tundra-like terrain. You get an awful lot of very, very boggy terrain that's really difficult going. And then you get a final line of mountains, the Richardson Mountains, which run out of the Yukon territory into the Northwest Territories, and that's where I finished.
And how many miles a day roughly were you doing in that terrain?
It varied enormously, much more than on a trail walk, because again, so much depended on the terrain, what the terrain was like. I mean, the average ended up as 12.5 miles a day. But there were days when I was on, dirt roads and sometimes even highways, though mind you, in the northern Yukon all the highways are dirt anyway, when I was doing 25 miles a day. And there were days in the wilderness going cross country when I couldn't even manage, 10 miles in 12 hours.
So it was very varied walking. Was it easy to plan the walk? I mean, how easy was it to get to accurate maps back in the UK?
It wasn't. It was easy to plan it in a sense that I could happily draw lines across these, 1 to 250,000 maps I had and think, oh yeah, I'll go that way. Oh yeah, I'll go this way. Whilst knowing that actually, I'd have to decide at the time. I mean, the main aim I had with the route was obviously to get to the next supply point, but how I got there was decided almost in place on a day-to-day basis, and on any local knowledge, if there was any, I could pick up. But often it was a question of looking at the maps, looking at the terrain, and saying, well, I obviously want to follow this valley because it runs in the right direction. And then working out what the easiest way to do it was, which could be everything if the river was shallow to actually walking up the river, or following a ridge if it was feasible above the valley. And sometimes you get to a valley head and there'd be cliffs, and I think, well, I can't get up there, so I've got to backtrack and go up one of the sides. And sometimes I didn't even know exactly, which valley I was in. But as long as it was going in the right direction, it didn't really matter.
And presumably the maps themselves were of a large scale and maybe were quite old, were they?
Oh, some of the maps were very old. I mean, there's not a great demand for maps there. So things like the Alaska Highway and the Dempster Highway, which were built in the 60s, were not on the maps. I mean, because I had supply drops along the Dempster Highway, I drew it in on some of the maps, so I knew where it was. And some of the maps are black and white as well, which can make it interesting trying to distinguish contour lines and rivers from each other.
I mean, given that, I mean, today a lot of us get very squeamish if we've forgotten a GPS and to take on the hills or whatever. But I mean, take us through that process of what it's like when you're that far out into a wilderness and you're not really quite sure which river valley you're in. I mean, navigation is pretty rudimentary and basic in those circumstances, I guess.
Well, it is, yes. I mean, mostly my navigation was based on, as long as I was heading generally north, I was going the right way. Because as I didn't have a set route, and as I say, most of the terrain, certainly south of Dawson City, I wasn't going to get stuck in any high alpine mountains or any places that were really difficult. So to some extent, it didn't matter which of the valleys I was in. I mean, most of the time I did know. I'd know which valley I was in. I wouldn't be quite sure where in the valley I was or how I was going to leave the valley. Because, I say, a lot of the route finding, when you're actually done by eye rather than by map, the maps simply don't tell you enough. They just show that there are woods and they show contour lines and maybe the occasional cliff. But there's nothing on the map that tells you which is the best way to climb out of this valley, whether you need to leave it before you reach the head of the valley or whether, in fact, you can easily go out at the head of the valley. Nor does it necessarily show you, whether the ridges on either side of the valley are open rolling tundra along which it's easy to walk, or whether there's jagged cliffs. It's only when you're actually there and you can see it. I did a lot of route planning in the short term, sitting on high points with binoculars and scanning the way ahead, trying to relate it to the maps, and also trying to memorize it so I could think of a sequence of what happened. So it'd be like descend into this valley, follow it until the river turns to the right, and then climb up the hillside opposite, and there's a little plateau there which you can follow, and then descend into the next valley, which would be as far as I could see. But if I could remember that, I would do that. And then when I was on the plateau, I would try and scan further ahead to see what happened next.
All right. Now, we've talked before about how the length of a trek changes very much the relation between yourself and the land you're walking through. The kind of, after 3 weeks, it becomes quite a different experience. But this must have been quite profoundly so. If you were in that level of wilderness in that sense. So I know that throughout a lot of the trek there were signs of the old gold rush, weren't there? So, presumably that was fascinating in itself. But take us through the kind of the mental routine that you would have gone through day in, day out.
Well, the first thing was, even compared with other walks, I had to very quickly get used to being on my own and expecting that whilst I was walking, I would meet nobody. The longest period I went on this walk without seeing or speaking to anybody was 10 days. But once I left the Chilkoot Trail, it was quite normal. I didn't expect to meet people every day, which meant I got into very much a routine that assumed there would be nobody else. And the main thing to concentrate on each day from a practical point of view was the route finding. But even that, after a while, becomes semi-automatic, especially when the terrain is similar to the terrain you've been walking through for days. So you learn how it works, and you can very quickly make an assessment about whether you can follow this ridge, whether this valley looks a good bet or not, and know that most of the time you're going to be right. Obviously that takes a few weeks to learn, but once you've done that, as I say, the route finding becomes semi-automatic. And the rest of the time, I was interested in what lay around me, what I could see in this vast wilderness, how it changed and developed as I moved north. Because again, I remember this as well from the Arizona walk, but one thing with a linear walk is you're walking far enough that ecosystems and weather and so on are going to change as you progress. But because you're doing it at walking speed, it's much easier to see the details of the changes.
So, presumably even in a reasonably low-level landscape, there's actually a lot of flora and fauna to be thinking about. What about wildlife, for example?
There was a great deal of wildlife, ranging from, deer, moose. I saw wolves twice during the walk. I saw grizzly bears twice during the walk, and plenty of signs of them at other times. The fact that this is grizzly bear country does give you an even greater interest and awareness of wildlife, if you like, than you might have otherwise, because you're always looking for signs of animals, and particularly signs of bears, particularly as well when going through dense undergrowth, but also when looking for a campsite. You only look round, and if there's signs of grizzly bear activity in the area, you think, no, I'll walk on for another hour and camp. I think the most stunning wildlife experience was one of the wolf encounters, because this was a night when I was not that far from the Yukon River, but there was a big meadow in between me and the river, and I was heading across this meadow at dusk with my water bottles to fill them up. And as I was crossing the meadow, which was overgrown, quite long, waist-high grass, I sensed I was being watched, and I stopped and looked towards the forest, and there was a pack of wolves moving along the forest edge. But because they'd obviously spotted me, I mean, I was out in the middle of the meadow, highly visible, they were taking it in turns. One of them would be stationary, watching me. When that one was at the back of the line, another one would stop, and the others would all move on again. And I just stood there for, I don't know, several minutes, just watching them. And eventually they trotted off into the forest and disappeared. And that night, I heard them howling.
I mean, they're quite timid creatures, aren't they? So presumably they were doing that to protect themselves.
Oh yes, they were obviously wary. They were keeping an eye on me in case I did anything that they felt was threatening.
Now, I mean, the encounters with wolves and encounters with bears kind of flags up the issues of security, I guess, because, well, I suppose, although 10 days solitary walking might not sound that much, I mean, if you were climbing Everest or climbing the Himalayas, you'd have backup, people would know where you were. I mean, you really are cut off, aren't you, for 10 days in an area like the Yukon? Did you have to carry any special gear for dealing with bears, or did you have a system of rescue, or were you really, really seriously on your own?
I didn't carry anything for bears, because although now you can get these pepper spray, they didn't exist then. I mean, the only thing for bears is keeping an eye open and making sure you protect your food at night. I mean, that's the real key. However, it must be said that bears become a problem and a threat in popular areas, Yosemite being the classic, but other areas as well, because they get used to human beings being around, and some of them eventually discover that human food is nice to eat. In a rural, remote wilderness like the Yukon, where they're not familiar with human beings at all, they're much shyer. And so I think actually, the bears were much less of a threat there than in more popular areas. And certainly, I mean, I never saw any black bears. The two grizzlies I saw were at quite a distance. I mean, far enough away that, I doubt in either case that they even knew I was around. So there's, I don't think bears was something I was aware of, because you have to be. But they weren't, if you like, a major concern. I mean, the thing I had to be aware of all the time, it wasn't so much how long I was out without seeing anybody, it was more that I'd only left a very sketchy idea of my route. And as I was changing it all the time as I went along, I tried to keep in my mind the fact that, nobody knew where I was, except very roughly. And so what I was more concerned about, were what would seem more mundane things, like twisting an ankle, any sort of immobilizing accident that could make life difficult. And as I got further north, river crossing started to become a more serious concern as well. I was much, much more worried about these things than I was about bears.
Yeah, because I guess if you'd have really twisted an ankle badly, that would have been 5 or 6 days out from civilization. That would have been quite an issue to deal with, I guess. Yeah.
Well, I mean, any sort of injury where I could even hobble or crawl, I'd have had to have tried to keep moving.
Yeah.
And obviously, because I got supplies set up, and I'd been assisted at the beginning of the walk by Yukon Tourism, who were very helpful. I mean, there were people who knew I was out there and what I was doing. So it wasn't the same as feeling, well, nobody is ever going to come and look for me or try and work out what happened. It was more, well, it might be quite a few days, if not weeks, before anybody gets to me. Though, of course, because, again, until the far north, because most of the time I was in or not far from forested areas, means something, that would be very hard to do if you're lost on the Cairngorm Plateau, is light a fire. But I mean, a fire is, of course, of great value, first of all, for warmth, but also for signalling.
Yeah.
And so I suspect if I'd been seriously stuck and I'd been able to light a big smoky fire, I would actually have been found relatively quickly, because this would have been spotted.
Yeah, it's nice to know that. I mean, at that point, we're talking 1990 now. I mean, were the people at home worrying and wondering where you were?
Well, I think they were probably wondering where I was, but they got used to me disappearing off on long walks. And of course, in those days, with no internet, all they would get would be a postcard, which would arrive 2 or 3 weeks after I posted it, so they'd know that, I was now somewhere completely different.
Yeah, yes, I must admit, there are times today when you think, well, yeah, 10 days without any contact with anybody in the world would be fabulous, but it's still daunting, I think. Now, I mean, in terms of the gold rush, and I mean, I haven't read the book, and we'll come to that later, but certainly the flyers of everything that I've read talk about the history of the Klondike and the gold rush all around. I mean, was that something that accompanied you much of the way, or was that just congregated in different parts of the trail?
Both, really. I mean, I was aware of it, as I say, all the way to Dawson, which was probably about 2/3 of the walk. It was very apparent, obviously, at the beginning with the Chilkoot Trail, because that actually follows the route that all of them took to get into the Yukon. What's interesting, though, when you read the descriptions of it, in the 1890s, the whole area was completely devastated. I mean, all the trees were cut down, there were shanty towns everywhere, because you're talking about thousands and thousands of people all going through at the same time. You wouldn't be able to tell now that had happened. It's all grown back. It's now just a forested wilderness trail. And it's only reading about it that gives you any realization that this occurred. But once the Klondikers had crossed the passes into the Yukon, they built boats and rafts, and they then went down the Yukon River to Dawson. They didn't walk. And today, most people who travel in the Yukon, canoe trips on the Yukon River, is the standard way of traveling. And I touched the Yukon River at various points, and thought about, the Klondikers there. But it was really only when approaching Dawson that I actually walked into the Klondike area and through some of the old mine workings, and met some modern Klondikers who were going through the spoils of one of the mines in the hope of still finding enough gold to make it worthwhile.
Because there wasn't that much gold found there, was there? Or have I got that wrong?
Well, there was a lot of gold found there. But again, this is where, communication comes in. The miners working in the area, a few of them found gold. But they then had to take the gold down the Yukon River to the coast in Alaska, get on a ship, and take the ship to Seattle, San Francisco. So it was like over a year later that news actually came out that gold had been found in the Klondike. Well, all the miners who were already in the area had staked every claim worth having. All the people who set out to go there in the gold rush, they were mostly completely inexperienced people who wanted an adventure. They were not miners. They were not wilderness people. They all set off. By the time they got there, I mean, I say all the claims were already staked worked. I mean, none of them had a chance of finding a claim or finding any gold. But lots of them, when they got there, hung around for a bit and then went home. Because I think, oddly enough, it was the adventure of doing it that mattered. And some of them, of course, worked out that all these people heading for the Klondike needed things, needed places to stay, needed food. I think the people who made the money out of the gold rush were the people who provided facilities for the would-be miners rather than the miners themselves. So yes, there was gold found, but not by any of the people in the gold rush.
Yeah, often the way, that, I think. So you talked about setting up camp earlier, and presumably one of the things you had to look for in setting up a camp was a place with a good set of trees or whatever. To presumably you kept your food way above the ground. That bare technique for suspending food, is that?
I did that where the trees were big enough. Yes, I mean in the north again, as I say, you run out of trees. But I also, because I mean the Yukon is not Arizona or California. A lot of the time it's cold and wet. Unless you're daft, you don't cook, eat, or store food in your tent. You do it, 100 yards away. So I took a tarp as well as a tent, and that proved really worthwhile because it meant, on wet days, wet evenings, I had a cooking shelter that I could sit under and keep dry. And often, I would light a campfire at the mouth of the tarp as well. So the tent was purely for sleeping. Because if you got food on your clothes, you tried to leave them under the tarp as well. You really want to keep food smells away from the tent.
Yeah. And in terms of gear, I mean, this was 1990, and it was and it's through some kind of wet country. I mean, take us through the gear that you had with you.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is going in terms of gear back into ancient history now, isn't it? My tent, which I'm sure a lot of people will remember, was a Phoenix Free Ranger, which was a single hoop tent weighing 1.8 kilos, which I think, in the late 80s, early 90s, was state of the art. I say I took a tarp, which weighed about half a kilo. Sleeping bag was a mountain equipment light line, a down bag, and one that's still going, of course, slightly different version. I had overnight temperatures ranged wildly from about -10 up to +20, so quite a wide range. I had an ultralight thermarest, another item that is still going, though I think the one I have weighed about 600 grams. I mean, they're lighter than that now. And I also, unusual things were I carried a 300-gram camp grill to place over campfires so that I could cook on them, which I haven't used for many years. I had a MSR Whisperlight stove, but there was certainly no chance most of the way of buying, say, gas canisters.
So you were carrying 10 days of fuel, petrol or whatever?
Yeah, Coleman fuel or similar. And I found that, a litre of fuel lasted 10 days. And I knew this well because this was the same stove that I'd used on the Canadian Rockies walk for 4.5 months, 2 years earlier. So, it was a stove that from the beginning I could use just about automatically.
Oh, okay.
The one chain, titanium didn't exist then for cookware, or if it did, it was very unknown. So I had stainless steel cookware, which was a bit hefty. And I mean, footwear, I took medium weight boots, one-piece leather boots. For a walk like that, I would probably use the same thing again. I might use heavy-duty trail shoes. But, a lot of the time, you're in very, very rough, dense terrain and not on trails. And for that, boots do give you that little bit, of extra protection.
I was quite fascinated last year by looking at Ryan Jordan and his colleagues' trip through the Arctic and looking at their very, very lightweight gear. I mean, is that the kind of thing that could be done today, or would you still be carrying it?
The thing is, the terrain they were in was very similar to the terrain I was in at the very end of my walk, which was tussocky tundra. I mean, the most difficult terrain I went through was the forests. And it's in the forests where you're constantly going through, fallen trees. You're getting your legs scratched by branches, you're getting your feet poked by sticks, you're getting your clothes caught up on branches and so on. But, I mean, certainly, if I was doing it, this was 17 years ago, I would reckon on probably cutting the basic pack weight by, at least a third, and possibly half, simply by replacing items with ones that were lighter. I mean, this was before, for example, you'd got things like, synthetic nylons for trousers and so on. The lighter stuff you could get then was polycotton. So I had polycotton trousers and a polycotton windproof jacket.
Which was presumably quite heavy in the rain.
Which would absorb water and take time to dry. I mean, quite quick drying, but, nothing like the stuff today. And I mean, waterproofs. A lightweight waterproof jacket then was about 700 grams. Again, much heavier than it would be today. Fleeces were about the same weight, and oddly enough, for the second half of the walk, when I was going to be further north and I knew it was going to be colder, I took a Rab down-filled sweater that weighed about 600 grams.
And nowadays, there's a lot in that kind of market, isn't there? That's very effective and lighter weight, isn't it?
There is, but again, you see, if you take something like that, for a walk like that, I wouldn't take a down top now that weighed more than 400 grams. So you'd immediately save 200. But at the time, that was, I think, the lightest down top available. But again, this is before fabrics like Pertex Quantum and other, ultralight nylon shell fabrics.
So that's fascinating in itself. You don't. I mean, you said earlier that you don't think anybody else has walked this same trail since. So maybe there is a challenge there for somebody that's listening to this. But it does sound as if it was a fascinating walk. You wouldn't discourage somebody from following in your footsteps.
No, not at all. No. I mean, it was a wonderful walk. I mean, it was full of interest from a whole range of things. I mean, obviously there was the challenge of the route finding and the navigation anyway. There's the whole natural history. There's the historical side of things. But there's also just the fact that this must be one of the last really, remote, little visited wildernesses that is available, if you like, for walkers. Where you don't require technical mountaineering gear or technical polar exploration gear. Where you can set off with just about the same gear that you'd use for doing the TGO challenge.
It's an endurance walk, really, rather than
yeah, I think like any long distance walk, it isn't. If you set yourself a target, I mean, you talked about, the backpacking light people's Alaska walk last summer, but in a sense, they made that an endurance walk by setting a high mileage per day target. Now, I didn't on this walk. I mean, to some extent, when I finished was open-ended. It happened to be 83 days. It could have been 93 or 73. I mean, I wanted to experience everything along the way. And I didn't want the pressure of feeling I've got to do 25 miles or more, every day. Hence the huge variation in mileages.
Yeah, I find it interesting you said that, because I kind of wonder a little bit. I mean, some of the achievements that people have had recently about breaking speed records for trails, I mean, like Squeaky Hazley's Triple Crown. I mean, it's fascinating in a sense because they are, supreme athletes. But I do wonder about that. I mean, I wonder, because surely the real experience in there is actually being out there, the enjoying it. And I was listening to an interview Bob Cartwright did recently with one of the podcasters, The Stays, and they were saying that they really wonder whether he had a chance to look around that much and enjoy the terrain in which he was moving through. And I think that's quite important, really. It's the experience, isn't it, rather than the race. That's the key.
It certainly is for me, yes. And I suspect that one reason why most of these, races, endurance tests are done on established trails is because you can then plan. If you're doing the Appalachian Trail or Pacific Crest Trail, you've got a set route. You know there's a good trail the whole way. You know where the route goes. Now, as I say, for this walk, nobody could replicate it exactly because, nobody from my description could follow the same route. And I wouldn't be able to follow the same route if I went back there now. It just wouldn't be possible. And I don't think you could set out on something like this and say, I'm going to do, 35 miles a day. Because apart from anything else, on an awful lot of days, I don't know how far I walked. I worked it out on the map and said, well, according to the map, I've done around 12 miles today. But because you're wandering about all the time and backtracking and making up the route, I've probably done more than that. But, I suppose these days you could carry a GPS and actually measure exactly where you went each day and how far you went. Though on a walk like this, you'd need an awful lot of batteries.
Yeah, you would, wouldn't you? But if you've got 3 months to spare and a curiosity about what it's like to be out in the wilds like that, it's something you'd recommend. So maybe somebody will take up the challenge, Chris.
Well, I'd be very interested, In fact, I'd love somebody to do it. It would be great to have somebody to talk to about it who might be able to tell me about, you went this way. Why did you do that? There's an easy way over here. Because there's lots of times, when I made decisions, and I don't know to this day whether it was the best decision or not.
Well, people listen to these podcasts in the UK and throughout the world, so there's a challenge to you listening. I'm sure there must be somebody out there with that sense of curiosity and adventure who's going to do it. But I have to say, as for somebody who's now beginning to get on a bit, I kind of rather would like to endorse the notion that it's the experience rather than the speed that's the key. So now the book is still available, I think. Certainly I looked it up on Amazon before we spoke, and there are 3 or 4 copies available second hand, I think, at the moment, but it's still occasionally you can find new copies. So it's still there. It's published by, is it Tab?
It's Ragged Mountain Press.
Yeah.
McGraw Hill.
Okay, so it's still around. You can still get copies of it certainly second-hand and probably new. And again, it's not as well-known a book as it should be, I guess. So let's try and encourage people to track it down and have a good look. Well, anyway, thanks very much for that, Chris. I think we're coming to the end of our time now. It was another fascinating trek. I hope you're getting closer to formulating the next one, the next long mammoth track we do. But thanks very much, and as always, it was a fascinating experience talking to you, and I just hope there's somebody out there that takes you up on that challenge to follow in the footsteps. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again to Chris Townsend there, and apologies for the sound quality, which wasn't quite as good as it is normally, but I hope that didn't detract from a fascinating story about a fascinating journey. I'm sure we'll be speaking to Chris again sometime in the near future. Until then, I'm Andy Howell. Take care and happy hiking.
This independent programme has been brought to you by The Outdoors Station, the exciting new way to see and hear free information about the outdoors world. If you're a blogger, or if you have a website, you can now incorporate any of these podcasts directly to your site, completely free. Visit our website, theoutdoorstation.co.uk, for more information.